All right, my favorite line from that song is, nobody calling on the phone except maybe the Pope in Rome. I think that's funny. So the gospel lesson for the lectionary today is continuing the Gospel of Mark. I told you guys, Mark is like our purgatory for this summer. We're not going to get out of him we get a little respite in John for a couple Sundays, but the rest of it is just the Gospel of Mark. Mark. So Mark is here. He's here in church this morning. So that's good. But Mark is going to be here in church. We're in the Gospel of Mark right now. We started into the 3rd chapter last week, and this week is the rest of that chapter. So we'll look at Mark 3, verses 20 through 35, and I'll be reading from the English Bible translation. Jesus entered a house. A crowd gathered again so that it was impossible for him and his followers even to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they came to take control of him. They were saying, he's out of his mind. The legal experts came down from Jerusalem, and over they charged, he's possessed by Beelzebub. He throws out demons with the authority of the ruler of demons. When Jesus called them together, he spoke to them in a parable. How can Satan throw Satan out? A kingdom involved in civil war will collapse. A house torn apart by divisions will collapse. If Satan rebels against himself and is divided, then he can't endure. He's done for. No one gets into the house of a strong person and steals anything without first tying up the strong person. Only then can the house be burglarized. I assure you that human beings will be forgiven for everything, for all sins and insults of every kind. But whoever insults the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. That person is guilty of a sin with consequences that last forever. He said this because the legal experts were saying he's possessed by an evil spirit. His mother and brothers arrived. They stood outside and sent word to him, calling for him. A crowd was seated around him, and those sent to him said, "Look, your mother and brothers and sisters are outside looking for you." He replied, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Looking around at those seated around him in the circle, he said, "Look, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother, sister, and mother." God add his blessing to the reading of the gospel. Thanks be to God. Well, so the problem here is that Jesus is out of his mind. There is concern. There's the people out in Jerusalem, no, they're not in Jerusalem, they're in Galilee right now, but the people out in Jerusalem who are these authority figures are trying to discredit him. And then somebody got his family involved. Vincenzo Pentangeli. So the Corleone family was backed into a corner. And they didn't know how they were going to get out. This thing was set up, and he was going to talk. So somehow they got Frank Pentangeli's brother from Italy and brought him into the courtroom that day. And the rest is history. Family. You want to control somebody? You want them to do what you want them to do? Family. It was the same concept that happened that day in Galilee. Things are getting out of hand. You know, people are coming to Jesus. They're rushing him. Like, heal me. He's delivering people from demons, and they can't understand what this is. It's usurping the power of others. And so, to discredit him, they call him crazy. We've never heard of that before, have we? They call him crazy, and then somebody runs and goes and tells his family and gets them to come here, and you guys got to do something. You got to intervene and collect him. That's what this reminded me of. This scene in The Godfather Part 2 where they bring in Frank Pentangeli's brother from Italy, and then the whole thing falls apart. And the Senate inquiry gets all messed up, and they get angry. But I think, how can evil dispense evil? Jesus asks. And then he tells them a parable. So my interpretation of the parable is thus. You may have a different one. If the devil is a strong man, then the good guys need to come and tie him up first before they can burglarize the evil out of the world. Maybe? And by casting out demons, Jesus is attempting to tie up the devil so that goodness can be burglarized out of the devil's house. I'm not sure, but it's Jesus' parable. Let's just leave it at that. So to get out of the snag with the family, he uses the logic for the devil thing, the Beelzebub issue. But to get out of the snag with the family, he redefines family. The people who do my Father's will are my mother's brothers and sisters. The passage itself is unsatisfying because of its unresolved conflict. It's just this, Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 35 is just this is what happened, and then this is what happened. And the most provocative part of that scene in The Godfather Part 2 is the look on the actor's face. He never speaks. He doesn't have a line in the whole film. He's just in that outfit, gets patted down by security. He looks like a guy who just got off a plane from Italy. And the way he looks at his brother when they meet eyes. What are you doing? Why are you committing, well, in their culture, this sin, omerta, you got to stay quiet, you don't tell the stories of the families and all this. I'm not debating that. That's another sermon for another time. But the look on their face, the way he knew at that moment, he couldn't go forward with his plans to betray. His brother was there questioning with his eyes, just his eyes. And maybe for Frankie, is it Frankie Four Angels? Isn't that his name? Frankie Pentangeli. Maybe his idea of family has been redefined. Maybe he understands that he wasn't really betrayed as he thought he was. It was someone else trying to make it look that way. And he knew who his real family was because it was sitting right there. But this passage is like that. It's just like, this is what happened, and then this is what happened. So my concern for this morning's message is what's not there. There's a lot that's not there in this story. We can get a visual of the scene because it's a crowded house. They could barely move and eat. And the narrator tries to make us understand about these accusations coming out of Jerusalem about how he's Beelzebub and if he can cast out demons, he must be a demon. All these things are coming at him. And the family shows up. But what I'm thinking about is what's not there. So last week, when we started out in chapter 3, the narrator in the story takes a look at Jesus' mood and motives. And it says in chapter 3, verse 5, looking around at them with anger, Jesus was deeply grieved at their unyielding hearts. So we get his mood and temper. We get a sense of that in verse 5. But down here in 20, we don't get any more narrative about how Jesus was feeling or where he was at that time. But you have to imagine this was a pressure cooker. We can only assume that he was angry and stressed. Again, these detractors have backed him into a corner, and then his family shows up, adding insult to injury. But Jesus doesn't react with much enthusiasm. He's not infurious at all. He's teaching a crowd that's encircling him. Could you imagine this filled house, this crush of people, and Jesus can hardly move? And it says that they couldn't even eat, which was probably the whole reason they were in this house to begin with. They were supposed to be there to eat. They were invited for a meal, and then the crowds just followed and they came in. And I imagine his family got involved, hoping they could just help him come to his senses about this behavior. Is that familiar? If you're concerned about someone, you go to someone in their family and say, I'm really concerned they need to come to their senses. You need to intervene. The NIV says that the family came to take charge of him. The NRSV says that the family came to restrain him. I like the Common English Bible translation because it says they came to take control of him. Because for some reason, it's their responsibility to control Jesus. No doubt they truly believed what they were doing was best for him. He had become a phenomenon. And the earlier passages tell us that the crowds were crushing in on him. They were unmanageable because those with diseases were looking to him to be healed and delivered of demons, and they were coming at him from all angles. He had to retreat in a little boat. It was an extreme situation. So he was causing quite a stir. And people were beginning to notice. And people were hearing about it. And it was making it stink. And the family shows up to try to rein it in. Okay, Jesus. It was fun and interesting for a while. But now it's time to get your feet back on the ground. He was crazy. He was out of hand. But to me, it doesn't look like, at least in this part of Mark's gospel, Jesus was either one of those things. You can rest assured that I know something about being crazy and out of hand. Because I pop off with the best of them. I can lose my cool. And friends, it doesn't take much these days with this midlife cocktail of hormones going on in my body. The conditions under which I find myself in these situations do make a big difference. It's best for me to be, as I say, left alone. In chapter 3, it seems like Jesus was trying to do just that. Get me a boat. Get me out of here. The crush of people. It seems like Jesus was trying to, well, at this point, get something to eat so he's not so hangry anymore. And as they go into the house, somebody found out where they were, and the place fills up. And I'll tell you what is terrible for these special times of rage or sobbing or irrational irritation. It's someone else coming in and trying to help, especially your family. They came to take control of him. Just go ahead and light the dynamite. Fan the flames. And yet, I'm talking about what's not in there. It's not like that for Jesus. He stays cool. He responds with logic. And consistent with Jesus' character, he is also filled with compassion for those who are around him. His family shows up to control him. All these legal experts have been throwing accusations at him. He's being backed into a corner in that crowded place when finally he can't take it one more minute. And he sits them down and tells them a parable. Wow. Well, that, friends, is the example of what I've been taught is a response rather than a reaction. He tells them a parable. He talks to them. His family is there to control them. I mean, Jesus, it's a wonder those people didn't get an elbow thrown at them. But no. I'm reading at what's not there. He responds. We know this. We ought to respond rather than react, right? Some of us do this better than others. Some of you are my teachers. And Jesus was the greatest at it. His anger was always righteous anger. Ours rarely is. The pain and suffering of God's children was what made him angry. And when it came to his own suffering or his own name being besmirched or smeared, that was the word I was looking for, smeared, he responded rather than react. You'd think he'd be more concerned with defending his position and reputation amid these accusations. But Jesus knows that all that reactionary, knee-jerk behavior does nothing to further the cause, but only hurts the people around us. It damages relationships. It causes folks to avoid you when you pop off consistently and aggressively. And people get hurt. Jesus doesn't like it when people get hurt. He fashioned a whip and knocked over tables in the temple because what was going on there was hurting people. And it was being done in God's name. And as far as the Gospels are concerned, he did it once, and he did it deliberately, and it was a protest against what was happening in the world and what was happening to people. When we want to use this incident I've just mentioned about Jesus getting angry in the temple to defend our own irrational reactions, we need to examine this again. Number one, that story was happening in a public place. Number two, it was a protest against greed and indifference. It was a plenary session, folks. It wasn't an intimate. And most of us know that our angry rants and our boiling over reactions happen at home and or in the company of those we love most. So it has nothing to do with Jesus' righteous anger in the Gospels. And it's indefensible when we do it in the home with the ones we love most. They're the ones who get to see our true colors, and I think we do that because, what was it? Was it Robert Frost that said home is where they have to take you in no matter what? So that's where we save our most savory personalities for these. And you know, I'm preaching a sermon to myself. Isn't it sad that that's where we save our angry rants for, our boiling over reactions? Jesus' family was there. He could have left the house. He could have confronted them. He could have really let them have it. And it could have been a terrific fight scene in the Gospels, but it wasn't. From this passage, it seems that to have self-control, you need to remove the self from the equation. Where we rage at defending ourselves and our own reputations, Jesus has compassion for those around him. where we might lash out to make a point in an argument, Jesus calmly and logically tells a parable. The Apostle Paul clearly thought this was an essential issue for the church in Galatia, for the church and both for the people and their interpersonal relationships. Maybe it was important for all the people that Jesus loved. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Told you it was last. I think Paul thought they were all important. And I tend to think they're all related to one another. But especially those last two. They're right there together. Gentleness and self-control. It leaves no room to defend our popping off and lashing out, our red-faced shouting, and our harsh words through gritted teeth. It's not the way Jesus reacted that day, and it's not the way we should. We need to learn to respond to the pressure cookers in our life. And if we can't, or feel like we can't, we need to seek help. Work through it. Retreat to a lonely place, which is what Jesus did. Punch a pillow, run a marathon, see a therapist. We need to do something. Because we're all walking in the way of Jesus. We're following his example. And when he's backed into a corner, when he's accused, when his reputation is at stake, he teaches them with a parable. He has compassion for them. And by this, we see the example of responding rather than reacting. And by this, they will see our fruit. Amen.